that in a sense this is signaling that there is a new relationship. And I think that I'm not sure whether I would use the discourse of right, but it seems to me that, that the recent conflicts, which the justness of them, or the correctness or the validity of these engagements, in a sense is generating a case for a right to more information, even during war and in the run-up to war, that there should be more of a flow of information and exchange, even though that might have consequences for the decisional process itself.
And what do you think have been the main precipitating factors? I mean, you could argue not just the coffins going through the streets of Wootton Bassett, but also saturation coverage of wars wherever they occur on every news bulletin? Or do you think it owes more to a new assertiveness on the part of citizens across the whole democratic piece?
I think it's both. I think clearly the media has always had a very difficult or troubled relationship with war. We can go back to the involvement of the Times in the Crimean War, for example. Did you want to say something? No? Yeah. And I think that clearly, and the Americans always had problem with the role of the media in the Vietnam War. Again, to go back to Sir Rupert Smith's book, he argues that, in a sense, the role of the media in warfare is now a critical aspect of fighting war. That the role of the media, in a sense, has to be understood within modern war fighting and the use of force. So when you're talking about the utility of force, you're also talking about the utility of the mass media. But also, I think, when you're talking about the utility of force, you are talking about the fact that people now expect a kind of new, I think, a new contract with the military.
Thank you, Wayne. Before bringing Michele in, I'll just ask, do any of you have any particular burning questions arising out of what Wayne has said? There will be the opportunity I mentioned later for more general comment and questions, but I don't want to lose the opportunity of getting your question in while the iron's hot. Trevor.
I think one of the things I find extraordinary in the present time with, essentially, Wootton Bassett and the press, general emotions, is these are soldiers. If it was the local laundry cricket team, you might feel there was an issue here. But surely if somebody signs up to be a soldier, and their families know they're signing up to be a soldier, is it not conceivable that they might die? That is the role of being a soldier. We seem to have got ourselves into a stupid situation where we must have an army that has no casualties. It just strikes me as being completely irrational. An army will always have casualties. Soldiers will die.
Is it that? Or is it, again, as part of the assertiveness that Wayne mentioned, that army families, like other citizens, feel less deferential to government, readier to say of particular wars, not in my name, to say it of Iraq in the way that they didn't, even looking at recent wars of the Falklands? Please. I think there is, have you got a microphone so we can all hear you? It's just being passed.
Yeah, so my question sort of carries on from that. I think obviously there will always be casualties in wars, but I think with as opposed to the Second World War, where that was a sort of a struggle for national survival, the current wars are almost sort of colonial in their aspect of where we're going to a country which is not a direct sort of systemic threat to Britain. And we're attempting to alter the way they do things there. So therefore, there is less public support, particularly because we've sort of lost trust with the decision-making powers of the people who took the decision to go to war. And as such, we want to know why they made that decision. We don't feel as though they are somehow imbued with superpowers and able to make better decisions than us. We think they made them for the wrong reasons, and therefore people are dying for reasons that we would not send them to war for.
Do you want me to reply to that?
Briefly.
I mean, regarding the first point, do you know my mother? Because this is very much, my mother is 86, and this is very much my mother's argument when you sit with her watching television. She says precisely that. And as an 86-year-old woman, she's seen quite a few conflicts in her life, and my family had lost 2 members in previous conflicts in the Falklands and so on. And her view is precisely that, in a sense, well, that's the contract, that's the deal. And as a wife of a former soldier, she understood the deal. Now, the point is that I think now we have a different kind of contract emerging in which the next generation is saying, well, yes, we get the deal, we get the contract, but we reserve the right to make judgments about the justness of this war or the efficacy of this war. And that takes me to the second point, that this is why I think a lot of decision-making regarding war, and not just war, actually, many other areas of public policy, have got to focus more and more on not simply making decisions, but building trust. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes, public policy can serve to undermine trust or build it. And I think that in a society which is based upon consent, in a society in which so many public policies, for example, about trying to change people's behavior, then the role of government as something that can be trusted becomes, I think, a critical variable in the equation of governmentality. That's why I think war exposes this problem in very vivid terms.
Thank you, Wayne. I'm going now to ask Michele to do her presentation, and then again we'll resume the debate after that.
Right, well, I was just going to say actually that some of the points that have been made already do emphasize to me that it's helpful to look at this question in a historical context, because I work on the First World War, and so I keep thinking all the time that we're talking about these things of how different things were then. And one of the things that is quite interesting, I think, here is that you know, at the Battle of Waterloo, afterwards, they just dug pits and chucked in the animals and the soldiers of both sides, and that was that, after the officers had had their possessions removed by their families and so forth. So the First World War brought about this big change where soldiers of all ranks were going to be commemorated, but they were not going to be repatriated. And that was a very big decision, which has been reversed in more recent times. But what you see, I think, with the sort of Wootton Bassett phenomenon is a bit like when at the end of the First World War they brought the unknown warrior back. And I don't know if you've heard about this. It was sort of like a kind of precursor of Princess Diana's funeral, that there was a mass outpouring of public grief and people being identified with the unknown warrior in the coffin that was being shipped back. And that sentiment has sort of, we've seen a big change from, as it were, I've sort of started with Waterloo and go up to Wootton Bassett. The attitude towards death in war has changed a lot. But I was also thinking about the First World War in relation to this issue that we hoped we'd have the person from the Information Commission, but we don't. That issue of information, because it was during the First World War that, I'm sure you studied it at school, the Defence of the Realm Act brought in all kinds of state control, state regulation and state censorship. And in a way, what we're seeing is a sort of peeling back of some of that state regulation. And then I want to say sort of a couple of more general things about this, because I think the first issue that has been brought up very clearly by the decision about the Iraq war is that actually these decisions about going to war are not sort of legal, juridical, or even, I think, policy decisions. It's actually probably the most important ethical decision that any group of people can take. And one of the things that I think is also interesting, if you take a more historical perspective, if you look at all the wars of the 20th century, which one, actually I could ask you to answer this as a question, which one of all the wars of the 20th century do you think was a just war? Quick, what's the answer? Second World War. I mean, it's not going to be any trouble. You're all going to say that. Everybody knows. The Second World War was the just war. The First World War, nightmare. Cold War, nightmare. Vietnam, nightmare. Second World War, everybody thinks, yes, we did the right thing. That was a just war. And what's very interesting about that is actually people tend to read it back and they know that at the end of the Second World War, my father was, along with an apocryphal number of soldiers who went into the camps at the end of the Second World War, that we know that the Holocaust